to Menopause University again. And although this is an education on menopause, I would say that about 80% of what I teach is really just health in general. And that is definitely true of today's video. I'm just so eager to give you this tutorial because I know that it could save your brain. This is video number 267, and it is part of a huge unit on Alzheimer's disease, and it's the 32nd video in the Alzheimer's unit. In the last 5 videos, we've been covering your dietary options for preventing Alzheimer's. Video number 262 gave you the significant factors that form the basis of using diet to prevent Alzheimer's. Video 263 addressed the differences between calorie restriction and intermittent fasting. Video 264 presented the antioxidant and anti-inflammatory foods. Video 265 designated the significance of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats in preventing Alzheimer's. And video number 266 explained the connection between diabetes type 2 and Alzheimer's and why some people call Alzheimer's diabetes type 3. So now you're ready for today's video, which is on fresh versus processed versus fortified and enriched foods for preventing Alzheimer's. My book is The Complete Menopause Education, and there is an entire chapter dedicated just to Alzheimer's. It's chapter 33. But please don't limit yourself to my book. In this and all the other dietary option videos, I go into much greater detail than I do in the book. The book is already pretty hefty. If I included everything in the book that I include in these videos, it would be too big to even call a book. Now, the reason today's topic is so important is that we live in a time when processed, fortified, and enriched foods are the norm. And there are many reasons that you might prefer the convenience and variety that these foods offer. You may be a busy career woman, or you may still have kids at home, or you may not like to cook. Regardless of your reasons for wanting pre-cut, pre-cooked, pre-packaged foods, it is important to know what your brain wants. On many occasions, I have told you that your brain and your body may not agree. Well, this is a situation in which your brain is at odds with itself. And the result is that both your brain and your body suffer. Back in video number 254, I explained that your brain is very lazy. It always wants the easiest possible way of doing things or achieving things. That's why the promise of quick and easy sells so well. The food industry has become rich by imparting the idea that messing around in the kitchen is time-consuming, laborious, and unrewarding, and your lazy brain agrees. But opposing the opinion of your lazy brain is your brain's need to prevent Alzheimer's. And on that matter, your brain wants the real thing. You know, there's a song by that name. It's Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, Baby by Marvin Gaye. Actually, the title is grammatically incorrect. It should be There's Nothing Like the Real Thing, Baby. It's your brain's song. As lazy and unwilling as both your brain and you might be in terms of buying and preparing foods from scratch, your brain needs the real thing prepared from scratch. This goes back to that principle of avoiding a fight with Mother Nature. Regardless of how much you justify wanting or needing to eat processed, fortified, or enriched food, your brain wants the natural, unadulterated food that only Mother Nature can make, or more correctly, what Mother Nature can grow or raise. Because the bottom line for your brain is that it wants the real thing that is grown or raised, not made. Like I said before, if it comes from a plant, eat it. If it's made in a plant, don't. So I think it will be helpful to give you a little history of the food industry just to shed light on how many different aspects of the food industry affect your brain. The early 1900s were a real turning point for the food industry. Before 1900, most people lived on farms where they grew their own food. But in 1900, people started moving to cities. And with the appearance of cities, our food supply became centralized and industrialized. Right away, many food companies started using chemicals and technologies to cut costs, forcing the honest food manufacturers out of business. This is when food started transforming from real to unreal. On many occasions, attempts were made to pass federal food legislation, but the food industry was adamantly opposed to government interference. They argued that leaving preservatives and coloring out of food would bankrupt the entire food industry. With every effort to regulate the food industry, the very thing that regulation sought to avoid occurred more and more. More and more nutrients were stripped out of the real thing, and more additives, preservatives, and artificial ingredients were added. The real thing was so pummeled, cooked under pressure, dried, bleached, roasted, and adulterated that it was really no longer food. It was closer to a plastic that is immune to decomposition than it was to real food. It quite literally was unreal. In many cases, processed food was, and still is, so far from the real thing that there's nothing left for our digestive systems to do. But your body's daily calorie expenditure is supposed to include 5 to 15% of your calories solely for the process of digestion. And without having to digest your food, those calories end up on your body in places you don't want them. Then, in order to compensate for the stripping out of all the real nutrients in the real thing, the food industry decided to advertise their foods as enriched or fortified. Enriched means that the naturally occurring nutrients that were stripped from the real thing have been replaced. Fortified means that new or extra nutrients that are not even in the real thing were added. Now, these two words sound enticing. They make you think the food is healthy. Vitamins and minerals are the most common ingredients that are stripped out of and then replaced in food that is no longer the real thing. I've always wondered how it makes any sense whatsoever to remove a nutrient that's already in the real thing, only to then put it back later. For some odd reason, people buy processed foods that claim to be enriched or fortified as if they're even better than the real thing. And what's odd about that is the fact that the original vitamins and minerals were 100% natural and placed there by Mother Nature. But the enriched and fortified vitamins and minerals are 100% synthetic and placed there by an industry that does not have to account for their quality. So this really amounts to adding unreal supplements to unreal food. There is no way for you to know anything about the synthetic vitamins or minerals that enrich or fortify processed foods. They may be toxic, impure, contaminated, or unreal. And they hardly ever come from the foods that actually contain those vitamins and minerals. Isn't it wild? If the food industry did use the real thing to enrich and fortify processed foods, the cost would be 5 times higher for them. The problem with this for your brain is that the real vitamins and minerals from Mother Nature can prevent Alzheimer's. But the synthetic ones used to enrich and fortify food cannot. They can even cause it. So So these unreal foods containing unreal supplements will really make it impossible for you to live in the real world. Nowadays, most people get more of their so-called vitamins and minerals from enriched and fortified foods than they do from the real thing. And your brain has a real problem with that. Your microbiome that I discussed in video 265 on proteins, carbohydrates, and fats is affected very differently by the two. The real thing contributes handsomely to it. The unreal processed things disrupt it. And a disrupted biome is called dysbiosis, and dysbiosis causes Alzheimer's. Along with all these developments is the general overwhelming desire for inexpensive food. Over the last 6 decades, the proportion of income devoted to food has dropped from 20.6% to 9.8%. So now we have a situation in which food companies have to find more and more ways to keep costs low, while still producing processed foods that appeal to your desire for quick and easy. But processed food has to meet many conflicting expectations. It has to taste good even after withstanding the injurious process of food processing. It has to be consistent, offering the same appearance and same taste every single time. That fast food burger tastes exactly the same every time you have it, doesn't it? The real thing doesn't adhere to any of these things. 2 pieces of the same fruit do not look or taste exactly the same. Processed food has to be able to withstand the process of food processing. And that's a very brutal process. No wonder it's unreal afterward. But it takes very little to injure real meat, fruits, and vegetables. Processed food also has to have a very long shelf life. The time required for all the processing, packaging, shipping, stocking, shelving, selling, buying, and finally eating has to have no effect whatsoever on the food. Have you ever looked at the expiration dates on processed foods? They're shocking. The real thing only lasts a few days. Whether it's meat, dairy, fruit, veggies, real food goes bad in just a couple of days. The only exceptions are grains, seeds, and nuts. This is why every culture has at least one grain as a staple in the diet. It may be rice or flour or wheat, and they are part of the cuisine because they keep for a long time in hard times when fresh food isn't plentiful. Outside of grains, seeds, and nuts, the real thing does not keep, but processed foods do. Expiration dates indicate that processed foods will keep for weeks or months or even years. Heck, you're likely to expire before the food does. Nothing with an expiration date beyond a few days is the real thing. In fact, nothing that requires notification of an expiration date is the real thing. If you stick to the real thing, you can plainly see how long it keeps. It starts going bad right before your eyes. You can see it. You can smell it. You can feel it. You can even attract insects with it. The real thing becomes rancid. These days, there is a field of study called food science. Now, that name sounds like it involves the study of food. Or maybe it has to do with cooking. But the fact is that it has nothing to do with either of those things. In fact, it really has nothing to do with real food at all. Food science is the science and technology of foodstuffs. Have you ever heard that term? Isn't it odd? Foodstuffs. Foodstuffs are substances that are used or capable of being used as a nutrient. They aren't actual nutrients. They're just stuff that can be pushed off on the unsuspecting public as nutrients. Now, the odd thing about this definition is that foodstuffs may or may not even be actual food. They may be completely artificial. The vast majority of foodstuffs are artificial. In other words, they are unreal foods. Within the food science industry, food scientists do look for ways to reduce harmful bacteria in food, but they also help the food industry develop more and more ways to modify the real thing. The food industry's lightning pace of innovation has always overwhelmed all efforts for oversight. In 1980, there were 2,000 food additives. Now, there are well over 5,000. Can you imagine? How can there possibly be 5,000 things that are added to foods? Does the real thing really need anything added? And the problem is that you have no ability to know what any of these things are. There is a database called Everything Added to Food in the United States, or EAFUS, but it doesn't give you any data on the substances that it lists. And it includes fewer than 50% of all foods and fewer than 10% of all additives. It's really just as deceiving as the processed food itself. There is no mention anywhere of something called ghost additives. Ghost additives are ingredients that the food industry has declared safe all by itself without any evaluation from the Food and Drug Administration. You see, the Food and Drug Administration has tried and tried to implement programs to control the food industry, but it has failed at every turn. At one time, it did put in place an approval process for all food additives. To comply with the approval process, food companies had to apply for approval before they could put additives in their processed food. But having been a company that has run amok since its inception, the food industry resisted and fought back. So the FDA decided to make things a little easier. They established a petition filing program called the Generally Recognized as Safe, or GRAS, for substances the food industry thought were safe. GRAS, or GRAS, was for things that didn't need an arduous approval process because everyone already knew they were safe. But the FDA made it voluntary. Food companies only had to let the FDA know about their GRAS ingredients if they wanted to. So the food companies just declared everything GRAS rather than applying for approval under the food additive process. And the torrent of new ingredients shifted from the food additive approval process to the GRAS process. Then, in 1997, the FDA made things even better for the food industries and even worse for consumers like you. They changed the petition filing GRAS process to merely a notification process. That meant the food companies could surge ahead adding anything they wanted to food, and they could send an email to the FDA mentioning it. But now, they rarely even do that. Most of the time, they just do whatever they want. But what the food industry wants is precisely the opposite of what your brain wants for preventing Alzheimer's. They want unreal, and your brain wants real. None of this even begins to address substances that come into contact with food during processing. So oils, cleaning chemicals, or packaging materials may contaminate processed foods, but you only hear about them after they've caused harm. There are over 3,750 of these products that can contaminate your food during processing. If you look at the cumulative effect of everything that food processing entails, it's enough to rattle your brain. In fact, it's enough to destroy your brain. It's just unreal. If you only ate processed foods once in a great while, it would still be bad for your brain, but most people don't do that. Instead, most people eat processed foods routinely. Every item that comes packaged is processed in some way. So the easiest way to avoid processed food is to eat only fresh, authentic, unadulterated food that looks, lasts, and tastes exactly the way Mother Nature made it. Because if you let the food industry mess with your food will mess with your brain. And that's because ain't nothing like the real thing for your brain, baby. Here's our chart showing the effect of processed, fortified, and enriched foods on your brain. Processed food of any kind, to any degree, by any company, with or without fortification or enrichment, serves to cause breakdown of every single step of your brain's function. Now I know I've probably upset you today. The cold hard fact is that the only foods that will prevent Alzheimer's are the real things that Mother Nature made herself and that you have to prepare yourself. I know your lazy brain wants to hear that there's some quick, easy way to keep your food preparation quick and easy, but that's just not the case. Just as you have to do new, different, and difficult things with your brain as a lifestyle measure for preventing Alzheimer's, you have to eat real food as a dietary measure for preventing Alzheimer's. All the focus on quick and easy in both realms is what gives you Alzheimer's in the first place. So this is where I'll leave you today. Next week, I'll discuss the worst foods on planet Earth for your brain. I invite you to schedule a consultation for anything your brain desires, and you can do so at menopausetailor.me. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and you can subscribe right here, right now. I'll see you in a week. Bye.